Hello friends, in this video we are going to discuss about analog pulse modulation techniques. First let's see what is the definition for analog pulse modulation and what are the different types of modulation techniques in analog pulse modulation and what are the definitions for each modulation technique in pulse modulation. First let's see what is analog pulse modulation. A modulation technique in which the parameters like amplitude, width and position of each pulse of a periodic pulse train is varied in accordance with the instantaneous amplitude of the message signal is called analog pulse modulation. In analog pulse modulation, here pulse is used as a carrier. In order to make the analog pulse modulation, here the carrier is changing in according to the message signal. What are the parameters in the carrier are changing means amplitude, width and position of the carrier is changing in according to the message signal. Okay, that is nothing but analog pulse modulation. Here in analog pulse modulation, amplitude, width and position of the carrier is changing in according to the message signal. Okay, here carrier signal is a pulse train. Remember this, carrier signal is a pulse train. And types of analog pulse modulation are PAM, PWM and PPM. PAM means pulse amplitude modulation, PWM means pulse width modulation, and last one is pulse position modulation. These are the very three important types of pulse modulations. Here let observe this flowchart. Here analog pulse modulation is mainly classified into two types. First one is pulse amplitude modulation, that is PAM, and next one is pulse time modulation. Okay, in pulse time modulation we have again two types. First one is pulse width modulation, that is PWM, and second one is pulse position modulation. Both pulse width modulation and pulse position modulation combinedly called as pulse time modulation. Okay, this is about techniques or types of analog pulse modulation techniques. Now let's see what are the definitions for pulse amplitude modulation and pulse width modulation and pulse position modulation. Here observe definition of pulse amplitude modulation. The modulation technique in which the amplitude of the carrier signal of periodic train of pulses is varied in accordance with the amplitude of the message signal is known as pulse amplitude modulation. Here observe friends, here the amplitude of the modulating signal is nothing but message signal is varying. We know amplitude of the modulating signal is continuously varying. In according to that amplitude, our carrier signal is also varying. Here carrier signal is nothing but pulse train. If according to the amplitude of the message signal, the carrier signal amplitude also varying, then the type of modulation is known as pulse amplitude modulation. Here pulse of amplitude of each pulse is varying according to the amplitude of the message signal. Okay, this is pulse amplitude modulation. This shortly we can call this as a PAM. Next one is pulse width modulation. Pulse width modulation nothing but the modulation technique in which the width of the carrier signal of periodic train of pulses is varied in accordance with the amplitude of the message signal is known as pulse width modulation. In pulse width modulation, the width of each pulse, we know here carrier is nothing but pulse train. Pulse train is nothing but like this. These are the pulse like a rectangular signal. Here the width of each pulse. Now in case of amplitude modulation, pulse amplitude modulation, the width of each pulse is constant. But in case of pulse width modulation, the width of each pulse is varied in accordance with the amplitude of the message signal. If the amplitude of the message signal is more, then the width of the pulse, here this is the width, this is the width of the pulse. Width of the pulse also varied. If the amplitude is more, then the width of the pulse is also more. If the amplitude is less, then width of the pulse is also less. This is pulse amplitude modulation. Next coming to pulse position modulation. This is the last classification of pulse modulation technique. Here A modulation technique in which the position of the carrier signal of periodic train of pulses is varied in accordance with the amplitude of the message signal is known as pulse position modulation. In case of pulse amplitude modulation, our carrier amplitude is varying in according to the amplitude of the message signal. But in case of pulse width modulation, the width of each pulse is changing in according to the amplitude of the analog or modulating signal. And last one is pulse position modulation. In case of pulse position modulation, position of each pulse position of each pulse is changing in according with the amplitude of the message signal. Okay, now let's see what are the graphs or what are the waveforms for the PAM, PWM and PPM. Now observe here, these are the waveforms for PAM, PWM and PPM. Now let's consider this is the carrier. First one is this is the carrier pulse train and this is the sinusoidal message signal or modulating signal. And first third waveform, this one here observe the amplitude of each pulse is changing but both width and position are constant. This is nothing but PAM, pulse amplitude modulation. Here amplitude is changing but position and width is constant. Here observe in this point we have maximum amplitude at the modulating signal. So here carrier also having maximum amplitude. But in case of here the modulating signal having less amplitude. So here modulated signal or carrier signal is also having less amplitude. Likewise here pulse amplitude modulation is varying. Now let's see fourth one, that is this is the pulse width modulation. Here observe the width of each pulse is varying according to the message signal. If the message signal amplitude is more, then width is also more. If the message signal amplitude is less, then width also less. This is pulse width modulation. Now coming to last classification, that is nothing but pulse position modulation. Here observe last one, this is here position of each pulse is changing. Observe here position of each pulse is changing according to the message signal. Okay, this is about three classification of pulse or analog pulse modulation techniques. I hope you understood. Thank you for watching this video.